All right. So next door is my friend Bonnie, and they are giving a talk about Angular architecture patterns. And I really want them to do well, because they worked really hard in their talk. So if we could just, on the count of 3, scream really, really loud, we're going to distract them and hopefully throw them off their game. So 1, 2, 3. Yeah! All right, that's good. I feel a little bit more energized right now. So yeah, we're going to be, oh no, not a long time ago, please. I want to jump ahead. We're going to talk about Ionic today. Show of hands, who's heard of Ionic before? My job's done. If you have any questions, find me on Twitter. It's probably the best place to look me up. I will post a lot of pictures of my cats. So if you do not like fluffy, adorable little animals that are just the best, don't go on my Twitter. You already saw the sneak slide. So a long time ago, we got to have a little background. We've been working in the Angular space for quite a while, and it's been an interesting ride going from Ionic 1 to what we currently have in Ionic 4. And it helps to know why we've done some things in the past if we have some historical context. So a long time ago, there was AngularJS. I don't know about you all, but AngularJS pretty much made my career because I could convince my boss that I actually did a whole lot of work when really it was just $scope, double curly braces. And he was like, it's updating as you're typing. It also was a reason why I joined Ionic, because before I was just a regular dev and AngularJS just did so many good things. From Ionic's perspective, AngularJS really just was probably the best option at the time for shipping components that could work across, that people could just take in and just use without having to understand how that component actually works, right? I think this is something that we're all fairly aware of. So when we found it in Ionic, all right, so we're going to take an impromptu pause. We're going to take an impromptu pause. You know the drill. 1, 2, 3. Yeah! Okay, so back to serious. We're very serious people. So after we found AngularJS, we started building out all these things in Ionic. And really, it was just a joy to work with. Okay, we're just going to continue. I'm not challenging that. I'm just impressed. I'm not even mad. Threw me off. Okay, we found AngularJS. We built a whole bunch of components. We were super successful. Community loved it. There was huge meetups all over the place. And there was actually a lot of great companies that had built stuff with Ionic. Has anyone ever heard of an app called Untapped? It's an Ionic app. There's a health and fitness app that has been featured on both iOS and Google's App Store. Over 12 million downloads. It's called Toolkit. That's an Ionic app. If you are fancy and you like to cook things with sous vide, there's an app for that built with Ionic. And probably the best one over here for searching different streaming services for your favorite show. It's like, oh, is this on Netflix, or is this on Hulu, or is it on HBO? Just watch. Go download it. It's super awesome. So we built the components. We gave them to the community. The community loved it. And a lot of the people that we talked to had this kind of same feedback cycle where they're like, hey, this is really great. I don't have to reinvent everything. I don't have to reinvent how tabs work. That just kind of, you get that for free. And this is really what we use as the guiding force. Like, how can we take something that developers would normally have to manually do and manage that and make it easy for them? Then we made the move to Angular, and with AngularJS. I was a little nervous when we did this. I went to the NGConf where they were going over all the then called Angular 2. I heard everything about @script and how they weren't inventing a language. It then made the move to TypeScript. We saw all the early versions of Angular. And while we were, nervous, we sat along with the Angular team and built out a lot of these things. So we were really early on in the Angular adoption, but we also had our own opinions on how a lot of this stuff should work. So between version 2 of Ionic, version 3, and up until recently, we've built a lot of our own custom stuff. For good or worse, we made a lot of custom things that solved some problems and provided a better use case for what we thought Ionic apps needed. So specifically routing, we built our own router. I don't think I need to talk about the router in Angular. It's getting better. Animations, gestures, we did all that ourselves, but we also built our own CLI, which is kind of difficult. But we built all this stuff, and then we started to notice that we weren't actually working on our components anymore. We were working on tooling, infrastructure. We were working on a router, things that we just don't want to actually work on. Has anyone written a router yet before? They are bloody difficult. They are really difficult, and they are hard to get right. And I really don't want to write a router. I'd rather just use something that already exists. And thankfully, we started noticing that seemed like it was getting more possible as time went on. Angular around 4 or 5 started getting really, really good. We had things like the Angular CLI finally reached their prime time kind of, you should use this right now. And I don't think anyone over here would argue that you shouldn't use the Angular CLI. Routing is now even easier to do thanks to things like moving to dynamic imports. But it's really straightforward to be able to say, here's the path, here's a dynamic import to the component or to the module, use it and be happy. And there's all the other features too, like internationalization extraction, schematics, anything like the custom builders that Wasim was talking about yesterday, all these really great features that Angular as a platform has really add up to show that Angular is pretty awesome. So we at Ionic, when we decided that we were going to do a 4.0, we're like, hey, what if we just let Angular handle Angular? Seems like whoa, that's a really crazy idea. Well, should we even try this? We figured it was worthwhile because we don't want to own the whole entire stack. We'd rather just write components. We're good at CSS, some good components. We're not great at routers. Having worked on it, yeah, the router is quite difficult. But the idea was to just utilize everything that the Angular platform has to offer and just build on top of it. Take what Angular has, use it, modify it if you need to, and reuse a lot of that existing content. And the first one that we started because it was so important was the router. Yeah, I don't think it's a secret in at least the Ionic community that routing before v4 was just very difficult. So the way it worked basically was like an in-memory array. When you started your app or the app bootstrap, you basically said, here's my root, here's the home page more or less. Here's where all my navigation should start. And then you would just push components onto that stack. And if you want to go back in history, you would pop. Array-like terminology to kind of get that across. There was no URL because we were focused on building native apps. There is no reload button on an iPhone. There's no reload button on Android in a native app. There were things that we just didn't need. We didn't actually have to worry about authentication guards because there was no way someone was going to modify the URL to get to the part there they need to be logged in if there's no URL bar. So we built all this stuff, and then we started noticing progressive web apps becoming popular. And we're like, well, we're a mobile framework. Progressive web apps are like a natural fit for us. We should totally adopt this. And then we realized, hey, we need redirects. We need authentication guards. We need a URL. And that stuff was just added on, and it became really difficult to manage. The router itself, the way it currently exists, is just very complicated code that's very brittle. It could break. It's just the nature of how routers work. And one of the things that I was kind of most frustrated about was you would see, here's the Ionic way of doing things, and here's the Angular way of doing things. Even though we were built on top of Angular, we had our own separate docs and side notes, like, side note, if you're installing this package and you're using Ionic, follow instructions 1, 2, and 3, but everyone else can just use the real instructions. It became really frustrating to see that and to see community people be confused, like, which one's the right one to do? So at V4, we moved over to the Angular router. And this was, not just big because we don't have to maintain a router anymore. It's better because now we better align with the Angular ecosystem. So what does this look like? Pretty simple. We have an array of routes. Each one of these we can do the direct inline component declaration, or we could use the new dynamic import syntax and load our component in a lazy manner. But we took it a step further by modifying the router outlet component and actually extending it with our own component called Ion Router Outlet. Now with this, when we navigate around into our app, there we go. When we navigate around into our app, just by using that Ion Router Outlet component, we get all these animations, gestures that look like they are on an iOS app. And on Android, they will have the material design kind of look and feel, what people expect for each platform. Now, nothing about this says, here's the animation to do in this situation. It's all provided by that little component. It's kind of one of the good things about Ion Router Outlet. Now, this is an example of what we call linear navigation, meaning there is a single place where a route could render, and there's only one way, one representation of history that could exist in this app. But native apps like to offer complex kind of history. If you've ever used Twitter before, you know that you have the timeline section, and then you can go into a tweet, and then go to a person's profile, then switch to tabs over to your direct messages, scroll down to the message someone sent you, tap that, go to their same user profile, and you can switch back and forth between each one of these tabs, and that history and that kind of in-memory state is maintained. Well, we were able to redo this and recreate this still using the Angular router with our tabs-based component. So over here, we have what we think is a pretty logical way of organizing this, where we have the main tabs route. Inside of that, we have an array of child routes that we could render. And each one of those will then get their own children that they could also render. So in this case, the first route that we have is tab 1. That means that you will go to tab 1, and then load that first child route. And then you can navigate to all the sub-routes as if they were just their own single independent navigation. Meaning that as we start to hit the tab bar at the bottom, we can maintain all of these histories independent from one another, but still have them be linkable because they're just using the router. Now, this is what we're calling stack navigation. I would really love to see this become a web standard or built into the Angular router itself. But it brings like the best of both native and the web, complex, rich histories, and a URL to share to your friends. All the good parts about the web, the URL, and native complex history. Okay, so history lesson part 2. Let's talk about CLIs. And really, we're going to talk about build tools. 2015, who was using Grunt? Who was using Gulp? Who was using Webpack in 2015? Who knew that Webpack was around in 2015? Who was using System.js? 2. So there were a lot of there weren't a lot of options back in 2015. I think there was like maybe one more, other than Browserify, which I know is up there. But build tools weren't really that complex. We didn't have these giant build scripts that we currently have. We just had, hey, take all these files, make one, and minify it. It's quite simple. Other things that we had like 6 to 5 for the people who remember pre-Babel days. Tracer, anyone? No, one person for Tracer. CoffeeScript probably was a little bit more popular, maybe. AtScript. Was anyone excited for AtScript? Because I totally was not. If you think about that, those times, how simple it was and how, maybe it was pretty, there weren't that many options and you could get started with any of them. There are so many options today, it's decision paralysis. I don't know which option's the best one. I just know that there's a Webpack, there's rollup, somewhere Basil's gonna come into here and I'm just confused. And I just wanna watch this one more time. Okay. But being completely honest, all those tools are actually really top-notch. Webpack, Rollup, Parcel, a new one called Pika Runner? Pika Bundler or something. I'm going to assume they're all really good. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist today. Front-end development in JavaScript communities are pretty cutthroat. So if a tool doesn't, is not good enough, the community will let people know. So there is incentive to ship good stuff. And even better, I work with Angular. I don't ever have to touch a Webpack config. That I think is a good thing to me. And because Angular CLI handles all that under the hood and configures it all, I can just go back and focus on my app, and they could update everything for me. Like maybe Basil will ship tomorrow, and we'll all just automatically update. I don't really need to worry about it. It's already taken care of by the CLI. Okay, so that history lesson brings us to a project called AppScripts. Now, AppScripts is a very interesting project. It did TypeScript compilation. It did ahead of time compilation. It did Sass compilation. It did everything that you would expect a CLI to do, but before Angular CLI was a thing, before it shipped, before there was even talk of a CLI. Back when the Angular CLI still had some bits of Ember in it. We wrote AppScripts because we needed to, not really because we wanted to. And while we were able to do really great things with it, I felt like sad Affleck over here every time I had to go in and fix something. It's like, I wish I could just write a component. I just want to write components, not fix build scripts. So we maintained it begrudgingly because and we also created this split where there was the Angular way of doing things, the Ionic way of doing things, and those two shall never meet. I think you can see where I'm going with this. We moved over to the Angular CLI. I don't have to maintain app scripts. No one has to maintain app scripts because the CLI is actually pretty awesome and it just works. The benefits for this, kind of selfishly, we don't have to maintain a build tool anymore. But for the community, from everyday developers, they don't have to think of different contexts. Like, I'm in an Angular app, here's how I do things the Angular way. I'm in an Ionic app, here's how I do things the Ionic way. It's just easier to focus on one tool and kind of build off that one central point. But we're super opinionated about certain things, so we want to have some say in how your apps get built or what dependencies are included. So we created a bunch of schematics and builders called Ionic Angular Toolkit. Basically, it'll go through and modifies the existing schematics. And when you go and you generate, say, a route and a component, we call this a page in Ionic. We created a schematic that just does that automatically. It adds the route to the router config and automatically makes sure that it's lazy loaded. So you kind of get built-in best practices. And then you can go even further with things like component modifications, and there's a lot of schematics in there. There's even an ng add schematic, so if you are building an Angular app right now and say, I want to try this Ionic thing, ng add at Ionic Angular. It'll go through, do the minimum modifications, and actually give you a way to say, hey, if you just want to try out our button, or maybe you want a card, or you just want one component in there, you can add that one component and then continue on and not have to go through, it's like, okay, well, how do I maintain this or port this thing from Ionic over into Angular? You can just do that. But there's a lot of other options in there too. So we've been working a lot in the Angular stuff, and that's been super successful, but we've also made a lot of cool things with Ionic in this 4.0 as well. CSS variables. If you were at the last talk, CSS variables got a quick little mention. If you don't know CSS variables or you are still thinking CSS and JS is a good idea, try CSS variables. They're really awesome. The fact that it is just like a runtime thing that is dynamic and you just change that value and it automatically updates without me having to do anything special is great. This allows us to do cool things like dark mode, which I'm a dark mode all the things. And the CSS that actually had to be used for this is that. First two lines are basically swapping the foreground color and the background color. The stepped color business is automatically generated in our documentation. So I give it the background, the dark color and the light color, and it figures out everything in between. I didn't actually have to write any of this, so yay for being lazy. But when dark mode ships in all the browsers, we'll get cool things like that automatically. We've also done a lot of work with our server-side rendering because we all know that server-side rendering is, it can be important and it can be a great benefit to your app. We're super interested in the pre-rendering strategy for our index.html. And if we can inline basically your app's interface before your app even bootstraps, that perceived performance is going to be great. Your users will say, "Oh, the app's already loaded," even though it's just the header bar, maybe a tab bar. We want to make sure that you can do that and do that in a really easy way that integrates with the rest of Angular's tooling. So we've created this thing called Ionic Server Module, which will go through pre-render and do everything for server-side rendering with our components. And you just add it like you would for Angular's Angular's Express Universal package, whatever the package name is. They change things so quickly. Another thing that we're also looking at is the virtual list with CDK. So we maintained our own virtual scroller, and while we were on this momentum of just reusing everything Angular has to offer, we've said, what if we just use the CDK instead of maintaining our own virtual scroller? Because virtual scrollers are quite difficult. We looked at the Angular CDK scroller, and it was actually really easy to just take this, add it to an Ionic app, and be able to reuse all of that. npm install Angular CDK, and add the scrolling module. Quite simple. And we get really great performance. And on mobile, I don't know, what was my oldest device? My old Nexus 4 was able to use this, and I had great scrolling performance. So we're looking at this and trying to figure out, do we just suggest this or wrap the component itself and include it as an Ionic component? And if you have any thoughts about that, I would love to know what your thoughts are. But CDK scroller is pretty awesome. Desktop is a new landscape for us. We're really good at mobile, and we're really good at the native mobile look. But now that we're doing progressive web apps, and you can save a progressive web app to your desktop, this introduces a whole new design pattern that we actually need to think about. It's like, hey, this alert looks really great on my iPhone, but it feels out of place on the desktop. It just doesn't feel right. So we're going through and looking over all of our components and trying to figure out which ones you think should get an update or be changed and modified to support desktops. Again, this is something that we are looking for feedback in. What desktop components do you think need to be there, and what components we should create for this. So please find me and talk to me. I would love to know this stuff. And then we've been trying to chase this goal of write once, run anywhere for so many years now. And we're getting really good. Progressive web apps have really helped a lot, but then there's also things like Electron, which make making native desktop apps really easy. We don't want to dive into this area where we have to move away from the web because we want to say all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we were trying to figure out how can we get this, what I would consider the golden deployment cycle, where the web team works with the components, they work HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they can ship an iOS, Android, a progressive web app, or a native desktop app. We think we have something with this project called Capacitor. We've been taking that extra time by not maintaining a build system and not maintaining our own router and creating cool new projects like Capacitor, which basically reinvent this whole cross-platform thing. So you could deploy iOS, web, Android, Electron. For this example, we're just going to write a file to the file system. Now, notice nothing about this code actually says, hey, I'm on iOS, or hey, I'm on Android, or I'm on the web, which doesn't really have a file system. Or I'm on Electron, which does have access to the file system. You can just use all of this, and under the hood, that API will get translated using proxies to the correct API. So on the web, if there is no file system API, it'll just run a quick little no op and say, sorry, we can't do that. There's no API for it. And one part about getting this right is integrating with Angular's tooling. So I am going to change display settings and just show how easy it is to add this. Demo gods, don't fail me now. Hey, NPM and Wi-Fi is actually working well. So we're going through, we're picking up all these dependencies. Don't worry about these warnings. I upgraded to Angular 8. What's my app name? NG Vikings. I don't care about that. I'm going to use npm because there is no other option. We just run ng, we'll just run ng builds. Please don't take forever. We don't care about that. But with that one command, we can now just run npm cap add iOS. There we go. You know, normally you would run a build, and if I had been a smart person, I would have run a build before the talk. But you get to see me just stammer up here while I wait for everything to build and everything to do. Now, other than the non-building part, I now have an iOS project, and I can now deploy this. And I didn't have to go through a whole bunch of hoops to get this to work. I can do the same thing for Android, but I don't have another 20 minutes to wait for Android Studio to boot up. Back to the slides. So this ng add is literally brand new, and still we don't talk about it because I finished it last week. And if you are, ambitious developers and you would love to try this out, please try it. Let me know what you think should work, how you think it should work, what kind of features should be added in there, and check out Capacitor because there are some really cool stuff in it. So, kind of wrapping up, we at Ionic, we are happy where we are at with this 4.0 because there's so many things that we don't have to focus on anymore. We don't have to spend our time maintaining build tools, maintaining a router. We can do cool stuff like Capacitor. We can do component development, which is really what we wanted to do all the time. And just build on top of Angular. The router is really great. Angular CLI is awesome. Angular as a platform is probably one of the, I would say, the best places to be right now. And it's only going to get better. Thank you.